We like to believe that we know the people closest to us, that the friendships we have built, the bonds we have formed, the connections we have invested years in nurturing, that these are genuine encounters between real people, grounded in honest, mutual understanding and authentic care. Carl Jung spent a lifetime dismantling this comfortable assumption, not out of cynicism and not out of any desire to diminish the genuine value of human connection, but out of the conviction that the first step toward real intimacy is the willingness to see clearly what is actually happening in the space between people. And what he found, after decades of clinical observation and his own unflinching inner work, was both deeply unsettling and, ultimately, profoundly liberating. According to Jung, as long as we carry within us hidden drives and social masks that we ourselves have not yet recognized, as long as the deeper layers of our own psyche remain unexamined and therefore unintegrated, genuine human closeness is, for all practical purposes, impossible. Not difficult, not rare, but structurally, psychologically impossible, because what we offer to others and what we receive from them is filtered through a series of unconscious mechanisms so pervasive and so deeply embedded that most people move through entire lifetimes of relationship without ever encountering another person or themselves directly. What most of us call friendship, Jung's framework suggests, is something more complex and more troubling than we would like to believe. It is, in significant measure, an illusion, a sophisticated, often beautiful, occasionally moving illusion managed by unconscious mechanisms, operating beneath the level of our awareness. This is not a comfortable claim. It is not meant to be, but sitting with its discomfort, following it honestly into the territory it opens, leads somewhere that simple comfort could never reach, toward the possibility of genuine encounter, genuine intimacy, and the kind of connection that can actually bear the weight of two complete human beings. Today, we are going to map that territory, 5 dimensions of Jung's understanding of what actually happens between people, what we project, what we perform, what we avoid, and what becomes possible when we finally stop. 1. The persona, the invisible masks we wear in public. Every morning, before we step out into the world, we perform a ritual that is so habitual, so automatic, that most of us are barely conscious of it. We get dressed not only in clothes, but in a carefully assembled presentation of self, a version of ourselves calibrated to the specific demands of the day ahead. The professional, the parent, the reliable friend, the composed colleague, the person who has everything reasonably together and can be counted on to function within the normal parameters of social expectation. Jung called this assembled presentation the persona, a word he borrowed from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. The persona is the face we present to the world, the sum of the roles we play, the expectations we have internalized, the social norms we have learned to embody in our outward behavior. It is important to understand that Jung did not regard the persona as inherently pathological. It serves a genuine and necessary function. Human beings are social creatures, and social life requires a degree of self-presentation, a degree of role-playing, a degree of adaptation to context. That is simply the practical reality of living among others. The persona helps us navigate social hierarchies, avoid unnecessary conflict, meet the legitimate expectations of our various relationships and responsibilities. In this sense, it is not a deception but a tool, a necessary feature of the interface between the individual and the social world. The problem begins when the tool becomes the identity, when the mask, worn so consistently and so completely, becomes indistinguishable from the face beneath it, when the person who put on the professional persona in the morning can no longer take it off in the evening, when the performance continues in private, not because anyone is watching, but because the performer has forgotten that it is a performance. Jung observed this phenomenon with particular concern. He saw individuals who had identified so completely with their social masks that they had lost genuine contact with their own inner life. The successful executive who had forgotten what he actually valued outside of success. The perpetually cheerful person who had suppressed her sadness for so long that she could no longer access it even when she needed to. The man who had performed competence and control so consistently that vulnerability, which is the necessary condition for genuine intimacy, had become genuinely inaccessible to him. End. When two personas meet, when two people, each presenting their carefully maintained social face, engage with each other in the ordinary transactions of social life, what actually happens between them, not a genuine encounter, not a real meeting of two actual human beings. What happens is a kind of elegant social choreography to performances, each calibrated to the expectations of the other, moving through the familiar steps of acquaintance, conversation, apparent closeness, while the actual people behind the masks remain, in all the ways that matter most, unknown to each other and often to themselves. This is not a failure of goodwill. The people in these interactions are not being deliberately dishonest. They are simply doing what the social world has trained them to do, presenting the face that functions, that is accepted, that generates connection of a kind, even if not connection of the deepest kind. The question Jung invites us to consider is this: is connection of that kind warm, functional, mutually comfortable, but fundamentally performative? What we actually mean when we say we want to be known. 2. The shadow, how the rejected self infiltrates our relationships. Alongside the persona, the carefully curated presentation we offer to the world, each of us carries something else, something that is never presented, that is actively concealed, that is, in many cases, not even consciously known to the person who carries it. Jung called this the shadow, the repository of everything we have been unable or unwilling to accept about ourselves. The shadow forms through a process that begins early and continues throughout life. From childhood onward, we receive messages from our families, our culture, our peers, our religious traditions, about which aspects of ourselves are acceptable and which are not. The anger that was punished, the neediness that was met with withdrawal, the ambition that was labeled as selfishness, the sensitivity that was mocked as weakness. These aspects of the self do not disappear when they are rejected. They go underground. They are pushed out of conscious awareness and into the shadow, where they continue to exist and to exert their influence. But now, beyond the reach of our conscious management and understanding, the shadow contains everything we have judged unacceptable in ourselves. The selfishness we deny, the jealousy we suppress, the vulnerability we have learned to perform competence over, the rage we have converted into perpetual pleasantness. And here is the crucial insight that Jung developed through his clinical work. The more completely and consistently we deny these aspects of ourselves, the more powerfully they influence our behavior and our relationships from below the level of awareness. This influence operates through a mechanism that is both fascinating and, when you recognize it in yourself, deeply humbling, because the aspects of ourselves that we have been unable to accept do not simply stay put, quietly contained in whatever psychological basement we have assigned them. They seek expression, they seek visibility, and one of their most reliable routes to expression is through our perception of other people. The person who cannot acknowledge their own tendency toward selfishness will often find themselves intensely, disproportionately irritated by selfishness in others, seeing it everywhere, responding to it with an intensity that others find puzzling, and that, on honest reflection, doesn't quite match the situation. The person who has suppressed their own vulnerability behind a mask of competence will often feel an inexplicable contempt for people who display vulnerability openly. The person who has buried their own cruelty under layers of performed kindness will sometimes find themselves responding to the cruelty of others with a visceral recognition that they cannot quite explain. This recognition, uncomfortable, unwelcome, and deeply instructive, is the shadow making itself known. And in the context of relationships, the shadow creates a dynamic that fundamentally compromises the possibility of genuine connection. Because if I cannot truly accept certain aspects of myself, if I have banished them to the shadow and constructed a persona that is defined in part by their absence, then I cannot truly accept those aspects in other people either. I will either be unable to tolerate them, responding with judgment and rejection that seems to come from nowhere, or I will be compulsively drawn to them, seeking in others the expression of what I have denied in myself. Either way, what I am responding to is not the actual person in front of me. It is the shadow, my own, reflected back at me through their behavior. And until I am willing to look at that reflection honestly, to reclaim what I have projected, to acknowledge that what disturbs me in others often lives in me as well, I am not in relationship with another person. I am in relationship with my own unacknowledged depths. 3. The collective unconscious and archetypal roles of all Jung's discoveries. The one that most fundamentally challenges our ordinary assumptions about the nature of our own experience is perhaps the concept of the collective unconscious. It is certainly the one that is most frequently misunderstood, reduced, in popular culture, to a vague notion of shared human memories or universal symbols, stripped of its more radical and more disturbing implications. What Jung actually proposed was something considerably more challenging than that. He suggested that a significant portion of what we experience as our own thoughts, desires, emotional responses, and interpersonal dynamics is not, in any meaningful sense, individually authored. It arises from a layer of the psyche that is shared, that precedes the individual, that was not created by individual experience, and that operates according to patterns and themes that recur across cultures, across centuries, across the full span of human history. These patterns Jung called archetypes: the hero, the great mother, the wise old man, the trickster, the shadow, the anima, and animus. They are not merely literary categories or cultural conventions. They are, in Jung's understanding, structural features of the human psyche itself, deep templates that shape the way we experience and organize our inner and outer reality. And here is where this becomes directly relevant to the question of relationship, because when we form connections with other people, we are not only responding to their actual individual characteristics, we are, to a significant and often underappreciated degree, responding to the archetypal role they seem to play in the drama of our own psychological life. We fall in love not simply with a person, but with the projection of the anima or animus, the contrasexual archetype, onto that person. We are drawn to certain friendships because the other person seems to embody the hero or the wise one or the trickster in ways that resonate with something in our own psychological structure. We choose mentors who carry the projection of the wise old man, colleagues who carry the projection of the ally or the rival. None of this is conscious. None of it is deliberate. It happens below the level of our awareness, through processes that feel like personal chemistry, like genuine recognition, like the inexplicable sense that this person is somehow important, and the problem, the specific limitation, that this dynamic imposes on the depth of genuine connection is that as long as we are primarily responding to the archetypal role someone plays rather than to the actual individual they are, we are not truly seeing them. We are seeing a cast member in our own unconscious drama, assigned a role before they even opened their mouth. Real relationships, the kind that actually grow, that actually survive contact with reality, that actually nourish both people over time, require the gradual dissolution of these archetypal projections. They require the willingness to see the other person as they actually are, rather than as the role we need them to play. And this is much harder than it sounds, because the archetypal projections feel so real, so natural, so much like genuine perception, that recognizing them as projections requires a quality of honest self-examination that most people find deeply uncomfortable. For projection, accusing others of our own unresolved qualities, we do not see people as they are, we see them as we are. This statement, which sounds almost like a paradox, is one of the most practically important insights in the entirety of Jung's framework, and it points directly to the mechanism that, more than any other, compromises the quality and the authenticity of our relationships. The mechanism of projection. The mind functions, in certain key respects, like a film projector. It takes the contents of its own interior, the images, the stories, the unresolved conflicts, the disowned qualities, the unexpressed emotions, and projects them outward, onto the screen of other people's behavior. What we then see and respond to is not the other person in their actual complexity. It is the projection, our own inner material, rendered visible on the surface of someone else. This mechanism operates with a particular tensity around the contents of the shadow. The qualities we have most thoroughly rejected in ourselves, the ones we are least willing to acknowledge, least able to tolerate, are precisely the ones we are most likely to project onto others. And when we encounter those projected qualities in the behavior of someone close to us, the response is often disproportionate, charged with an emotional intensity that the situation, on its own terms, doesn't quite explain. The person who is privately struggling with their own dishonesty will often find themselves intensely preoccupied with the perceived dishonesty of those around them, seeing it in situations where others might not, responding to it with a vehemence that seems, from the outside, to exceed what the circumstances warrant. The person who has suppressed their own anger behind a performance of perpetual equanimity will often find themselves deeply disturbed by anger in others, reacting to it not simply as an unpleasant behavior, but as something almost threatening, something that must be managed or avoided. In each case, the intensity of the response is a signal, not necessarily about the other person, though they may well have actually done something worth noticing. but certainly about the inner material that their behavior has activated. The charge in the reaction, the quality of being triggered, of responding with more heat than the situation seems to demand, is the shadow's way of announcing itself. And in the context of intimate relationships, this dynamic creates something genuinely tragic. Two people, each projecting their own unresolved material onto the other, each responding not to the actual person but to the distorted image produced by their own inner projection. These two people are not in relationship with each other. They are, in the most precise psychological sense, alone together, each inhabiting their own private reality, shaped by their own unconscious needs and conflicts, while the other person, the actual, complex, irreducible individual, remains, for all practical purposes, unseen. This is why Jung insisted that genuine relationship requires, as its foundation, the ongoing willingness to withdraw projections, to notice when your response to another person carries more charge than the situation warrants, to ask, in those moments, what this reaction might be telling you about your own interior, to resist the comfortable certainty that what you are seeing is simply the truth about them, and to hold open, however uncomfortably, the possibility that you are seeing something about yourself. This is not a comfortable practice, but it is the only one that makes genuine encounter possible. 5. Radical honesty, moving beyond the masks. We have traveled, in this exploration, through some genuinely difficult terrain. The persona that substitutes performance for presence. The shadow that infiltrates our perceptions and sabotages our connections. The archetypal projections that cause us to see cast members where actual people stand. The mechanism of projection that ensures we are always, to some degree, responding to ourselves in the guise of responding to others. It would be easy, having surveyed all of this, to arrive at a kind of bleak conclusion that genuine human connection is simply not available to us, that the mechanisms of the unconscious are too pervasive and too powerful to overcome, that the best we can do is perform connection well enough to get through our social lives with a reasonable degree of comfort. Jung did not draw this conclusion, and neither should we, because alongside his unflinching analysis of what compromises genuine connection, Jung developed an equally clear and ultimately hopeful account of what makes genuine connection possible. He called it authentic encounter, those specific, rare, and precious moments when two individuals take the risk of showing their unmasked selves to each other, of stepping out from behind the persona, of bringing the shadow into the light rather than keeping it carefully concealed, of meeting another person as they actually are rather than as a screen for projection. This is not a state that can be permanently achieved. It is not a destination you arrive at and then maintain without effort. It is a practice, an ongoing, demanding, frequently uncomfortable practice of choosing honesty over performance, vulnerability over defense, genuine perception over the comfort of projection. It begins with the willingness to withdraw your own projections. When you find yourself responding to someone with disproportionate intensity, with a charge of emotion that exceeds what the situation objectively warrants, to pause, to ask, what is this reaction telling me about my own interior? What am I seeing in this person that I am not yet willing to see in myself? This single practice, sustained over time, begins to dissolve the projection mechanism that keeps you perpetually in relationship with your own unacknowledged depths, rather than with actual people. It continues with the willingness to take responsibility for your own emotional responses, to stop treating your feelings as simple, transparent reactions to objective reality, and to begin recognizing them as complex, partially authored by your own history, your own wounds, your own unprocessed material. This does not mean dismissing your feelings or denying their validity. It means holding them with a degree of curiosity, treating them as information about your inner life, rather than simply as evidence about the outer world. And it culminates, in Jung's understanding, in the possibility of genuine friendship, the kind that he described as being seen in your full complexity, including the aspects you are least proud of, and being chosen anyway. Not loved for the persona, for the performance of competence or pleasantness, or whatever quality the mask presents, but known, as fully and honestly as two people can know each other, and valued for the actual self that the knowing reveals. This kind of friendship is rare. It requires both people to have done, or to be willing to do, enough inner work to sustain the exposure it demands. It cannot be rushed, cannot be manufactured, cannot be produced by the social rituals of connection that function well enough for the persona but cannot reach the deeper self. But it is available. It is genuinely, specifically, concretely available to anyone willing to pay the price of admission, which is nothing more and nothing less than the sustained willingness to be honest with yourself first, and then, gradually, carefully, with the people who have earned the right to that honesty through the quality of their own. We began today with a claim that was meant to unsettle. That genuine human connection, for most people most of the time, is compromised by unconscious mechanisms so pervasive that what we call friendship is often, at least in part, an illusion. We end with something more nuanced and more hopeful than that initial claim suggested. Not the denial of the illusion, it is real, and recognizing it is genuinely important, but the recognition that the illusion is not the final word, that beneath the persona there is a real self, that within the shadow there is material that, when integrated, rather than denied, deepens rather than diminishes our capacity for connection, that beneath the archetypal projections and the distortions of personal projection, there are actual people, complex, irreducible, genuinely other, waiting to be seen. The path toward seeing them begins, always and without exception, with the willingness to see yourself, to look honestly at the mask you are wearing and ask what it is protecting, to look honestly at the charge in your reactions and ask what they are reflecting, to look honestly at the roles you have assigned to the people in your life and ask whether you are seeing them or only yourself. This is the work that Jung spent his life pointing toward, not the comfortable work of building a better persona, a more effective social performance, but the genuinely transformative work of becoming, gradually and with considerable difficulty, someone who can actually be present to themselves and to others without the protective distance of the mask. That presence offered and received is what genuine connection actually is. It is rarer than we would like, it is harder than we expected, and it is, for exactly those reasons, among the most valuable things available to any human life. Know yourself, and then, perhaps for the first time, you will begin to know others.